Delegate, thank you for the bill. I appreciate the intent behind it. A couple questions. So your goal here is not to ban digital devices, right? Okay, so we're looking at common sense, health-based, research-based restrictions here. So there was a lot of conversation in the testimony here about visual impacts, and particularly the blue light studies that have focused on the impact on circadian rhythms and recommended not using screens near bedtime, which obviously wouldn't be happening in school, but there is some truth to that. But this bill's pretty broadly written, so it would affect things like ergonomics, and I'm seeing some nodding heads. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, so if MSDE were, for example, to determine that students shouldn't be using computers at their existing student desks, like the pupil desks that exist right now in most schools, these guidelines could require that every school system in the state replace every desk in the state.
You know, Delegate, I understand that, and that's I think I prefaced my testimony with, you know, we've geared ourselves to run ourselves around with this, and that's the methodology we have chosen as, I guess, leaders, if you will, for our schools. The school system chose that. I think Cindy has a little bit more information on that, but fundamentally, I think you're right.
The issue with the difference between MSDE putting in guidelines and DHMH putting in guidelines is significant, mostly because we need people who are already in the medical community who have access to new information. Remember, this is all very new. We've had people on computers for a long time. We haven't had 5-year-olds on them. And so the pediatricians, and that's why I'm so glad they've endorsed this, the pediatricians who know the difference between the development of a 3-year-old, the development of a 5-year-old, and the development of an 18-year-old, these may be 3 different sets of guidelines. That's why we need the practitioners.
Right, but that wasn't really my question. My question was these regulations, I mean, because the fiscal note says there's no fiscal impact of developing the regulations, but there could certainly be a massive fiscal impact on the school system depending on what the regulations are.
I think that's a straw man argument. I think I've never heard it. What the fiscal note actually says is it's real easy to mitigate the damage by reducing screen time. So I don't see any cost impact in just taking a break or using these in a way that reduces the harm. What we're looking for is the people in our government, DHMH and MSDE, working together to create a healthy balance for the computers that they already have and guidance on how to use them appropriately. As for the melatonin at night, if you're on a computer all day at school, you have to study at night on that laptop. And so the schools are directing the kids to use these things into the night, and that is impacting melatonin at the direction of the schools, who have a legal responsibility to avoid known harm. We now have a known harm.
Ma'am, I don't disagree that there are health impacts here, and I don't disagree that the schools should be doing something about it. The discussion needs to be about the most effective way to do that, and in a way that's based on, I think you'll admit that while there's some research to back some of this up, there's also some conversations about technology that are not research focused, and we want to make sure that this is all research focused, and we also want to make sure that the school systems are actually able to implement it in an effective way. So your belief is that the medical research is not enough, that it would require, for example, large-scale replacement of seating in the classroom? Not a bit.
Taking breaks, stretching, using it appropriately, and addressing the park testing in particular, as we've heard today. It's 110 minutes straight for 1 unit of testing for an 11-year-old child. There is exactly 1 break that's allowed. It's 3 minutes long, and it's often not given because the teachers want to rush through it. That's the kind of common sense that we're talking about here is, okay, let's slow down, and let's make sure that the doctors are working with the educators to create a healthy balance so our kids can master this technology without being harmed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to say, my goodness, I don't know why I didn't think of this, because I feel like I've been fighting this battle with my own daughters for, for probably the last 4 or 5 years. And, you know, everything you're saying is absolutely spot on. I mean, just the addiction, really, to these devices. My question is this, and it's not just the addiction, obviously, they're being required to use it at school, and there has to be a safe way to do it. But the challenge I'm having that hopefully you would be open to is that young people are also bringing their personal cell phones into the classroom as well. So what I've seen in terms of addiction is not so much those devices that are in the classroom, but there's also their own personal devices. And sometimes now in school, they're being required to look things up on their own personal devices. And in that time, they're texting each other, cheating on exams. That's going on a lot, but that obviously isn't part of this bill. But would you be open to including personal cell phones in that study, and how to either incorporate them into classwork or bar them from classwork? Would you be open to that?
First of all, it's not a study. This mandates that DHMH creates guidelines and that they get implemented. There's no study. Secondly, I appreciate and respect the position of any educator who says a lot of this is a local decision, a lot of this is a local school board. So I don't believe that this bill even addresses cell phones whatsoever. I think those are local school board issues. What is not local, what is important across the state is that we have uniform safety guidelines for the school equipment. Whether or not the school lets cell phones in is up to them. However, regarding addiction, if you key into a lot of what the popular literature is among educators, you'll find a lot of interesting words. One of them is gamification. I know that sounds like an odd word, but as I was listening to the testimony earlier, and I listened to that nice man talk about being addicted at the age of 10, that's what we're looking at here. When everything is presented like a happy little bubble, a click, 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 and when the curriculum itself is being encouraged to be gamified, when you have a teacher in a classroom with Google Classroom encouraging the kids to constantly email each other, sitting next to each other in class, emailing each other, that is the encouragement, in my personal opinion, of a very dangerous and unnecessarily dangerous position. So it folds over. If the teacher's telling you to email, well, then you've got to have a cell phone, you've got to email. It is the behavior, it's the constant behavior of the kids on screens, whether or not they're at school or whether or not they're at home. What we can regulate is what is in the school.
Okay, thank you.
Chair. Okay, so I think I'm circling back. I might be saying the same thing that Delegate Lukey said. Oftentimes, it's hard for me to think of something that he hasn't thought of already. But I try. So I'm just reading the language, and it's in an education article, so it says in consultation with the department. Of course, that refers to the Maryland State Department of Education. Consultation means that DHMH still gets to call the shots in the end. So I'm wondering if we couldn't amend it in some way so that they would work together to develop these, so that MSDE could have input on the efficacy of some of the decisions that are made in terms of what they can actually manage financially.
I'm hoping they're grown-ups. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that doctors are going to lead the way and that MSDE is going to work with them as grown-ups to protect the kids.
So my question still is would it be possible, I'm going to ask the sponsor this question, would it be possible to consider an amendment where it's a joint decision by these two groups rather than one calling the shots for the other?
I believe it would be possible. I think they need to talk. They need to have the information, so the doctors would have to figure out what the schools are actually doing.
And sometimes we have to tell them too. They're grown-ups, but sometimes they don't like to talk to each other. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that again, as the bill is currently written, as the delegate points out, MSDE could say, well, here's the impact on education of these new requirements, but what this bill is saying is that DHMH can just say, nah, sorry, we're just going to issue these without regard to the educational impacts.
I don't think that it's going to go that way. I don't think it's without regard, and I think our children's health must come first.
Okay, you don't think it's going to go that way? Why?
Are you asking me?
Go ahead, Delegate.
Actually, I think what's paramount here, Delegate, is the health of the child. I believe that when I go to a doctor, or if I have my school nurse or I have my doctor, I'm going to go to my doctor. And I think what the bill's intent is to sit back and say, we know what's hurting our kids or not hurting our kids, and how we're ultimately trying to address the child, not necessarily the school. And I understand your concerns, but we don't know that until the guidelines come out. I think the delegate brought up something about having MSDE involved. Absolutely, because I think they have to sit down and already state what are the guidelines, because I don't think we're clear on that in any school. So I see your point. I don't necessarily understand that it's a problem yet, because I really don't know what DHMH is going to do.
Yeah, I mean, Delegate, respectfully, and again, I support the intent of the bill. But it doesn't require consultation with the local school boards, just with MSDE. It doesn't require that MSDE agree to any requirements. It just requires consultation, which could be one email like, hey, let us know what you think. It's very broadly drafted. And some of the testimony here today, used data that is not, I think, based in the reality of what medical research is saying. There may be a study here or there, but for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no more than 2 hours of entertainment screen time a day. And to my knowledge, they haven't issued recommendations about the amount of screen time that should be used for learning practices. So, that's why I'm expressing these concerns.
I'd really like to comment on that if I could.
Hold on, ma'am. I think you and I should touch base offline and talk through this.
I would welcome.
Thank you.
You said some things that simply aren't true. Yes, it's true that the AAP has only issued guidelines regarding entertainment, and I have spoken directly with the National Academy of Pediatricians on that issue, and that's why I think you'll find in your packet a letter where the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics is weighing in on this. They have no guidelines in the classroom, and they recognize that it's overdue. As for the studies, I would welcome you to go to www.screensandkids.us, where there is lengthy documentation. Again, the doctors in this state didn't blithely sign on to this. They recognize there is significant scientific evidence behind the need for this bill. And as for the dynamic between DHMH and MSDE, again, I think that the whole bill is to make them cooperate. I don't see it as a turf war. I see it as a cooperative effort to protect our children.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more person on this bill, Pam Casemeyer.
Hi, I'm Pam Casemeyer. I'm here today on behalf of the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the State Medical Society. Maybe I can put a little bit of context in this conversation from the professional association's perspective. They read this bill and maybe even addressed the question of whether it should be the two agencies equally or in consultation. I think the reason they're here in support is they think it creates an opportunity for MSDE and DHMH to develop guidelines that would be useful for the local jurisdictions on this issue. There are benefits to technology and there are risks associated with it. I know that there is research around risk. There's also a lot of conversation about the benefits that people get in the educational system from technology as well. So this is not an all good or bad from their perspective, but I think they've seen a patchwork of policies across the states, across the counties. I think it's an area where legitimately the local jurisdictions may or may not have the time or expertise to sit down and put a framework together. I think it's a balance of framework, and I think the two departments working together to put a framework together that could be useful for all of the jurisdictions. And so there would be consistency across the jurisdictions as well, which is the other comment that was made by the pediatric community, is that the consistency in all jurisdictions would be a good thing.
Any more questions? Delegate Lukey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Pam. I really appreciate it. Can I ask, so AAP has this recommendation about 2 hours of screen time for entertainment purposes. Is AAP nationally working on guidelines more broadly for educational impacts?
I may have to get back with you on that answer. I'm not sure. I would suspect there's researchers working on that. I don't know yet what's been officially adopted from the AEP on those issues, but I'm glad to check. I'm glad to find out with them.
Can you follow
I think
up?
there's, yes.
I'd be curious about that and whether
Yes.
FDA or if there's any other guidance, or if we'd sort of be asking DHMH to consolidate research and then create everything from scratch.
No, let me find that out, but I do think there are guidelines. I think is information out there that would be useful. That was the impression I got when they talked about it, because they actually thought it might be an easier way to handle this, to do it with the two departments together, balancing the objectives of pro-technology and risks. And so let me find out, and I'll get back to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Any other questions from the panel? If not, thank you very much. I believe Delegate Walker, you're